Hey everyone, welcome back to another Data Dive. My name is Tyler Nethercott, better known as Teapot, and this week, continuing to some extent where we left off last week, definitely staying in the philosophical and the abstract, but hopefully bringing things back down to the practical level. We're talking about card values. What is your card worth? What's its value? I won't be covering how to find and use direct or analogous comps, or how to use indexes or ratios to arrive at the value of something, a specific card without comps. Instead, taking a more macro look at the cards as a whole, the factors that contribute to the value of a card, as well as the circumstances that can impact what a card actually sells for. And before we get into that, I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for the incredible feedback last week. A handful of critics and people who didn't seem to understand what I was getting at, or at least didn't appreciate it or agree with it, totally fine. But by and large, the comments were overwhelmingly positive, and many of you even took to Instagram to DM me or even to share it to your stories. So that means the world to me. These videos that I'm making are really a labor of love. They're all about the passion that I have for the hobby and the cardboard and the community. And I'm just trying to share information that I think would be valuable to others. So seriously, thank you. And of course, these videos are also about my passion for data. And this data is sponsored by Market Movers. Market Movers is our data analytics tool, now tracking over 650,000 cards and more than 1,300 sealed wax products. We're bulking up our data team even more to prepare to add Pokemon and other TCG. We actually now have Pokemon sealed wax boxes in our sealed wax universe. So go ahead and give Market Movers a try, absolutely free for 7 days by visiting marketmoversapp.com and using promo code TRIAL. Now let's get into the conversation. So starting out, this video was really inspired by Victory Investments, by a story that he posted not too long ago in the last couple of weeks that really got me thinking and really resonated a lot with me. I will show you here kind of some of the things that he posted, but that's where this thought came from for this episode. If you're not following Victory Investments, he's only got, I don't want to say only, but he's got 4,500 followers. In my opinion, he should have way more than that. He puts out awesome comedic little skits, rap music about the hobby and about cards. He did the intro for Jeremy Lee's Sports Cards Live. Really great account, and always a lot of really good insights and even stories about the history of the cardboard. So go ahead and give him a follow if you would. So here's the story. We'll go through it, and then we're going to kind of break it down as we walk through this particular video. So he said, while sales data is great and useful, don't fall trapped to allowing sales data to outspeak your own personal collector intuition. Narratives often change, and if you're led only by the sales data, you could be handcuffing yourself. Example, card sold 2 years ago for $1,000, 1 year ago for $1,200, 6 months ago for $1,350, and now there's a seller asking $1,400. The buyer misses it, trying to get it for under the last comp, handcuffed by the sales data. The same card sells 6 months from now to someone else for $1,700. The money is one thing, but being led 99% by sales data makes many people miss PC cards that they really like. If you like something, there is always someone else with the same taste, but they may be just a few steps behind you in noticing. What truly sets a market value is when a collector gets his hands on something of limited supply compared to demand, and he's unwilling to let it go. When what it's worth to him meets what someone else is willing to pay, there you have market value. So, really good insights. We're going to walk through each of these things here. So while sales data is great and useful, don't fall into the trap of allowing sales data to outspeak your own personal collector intuition. Now, what's really interesting about this is that without data, with no data whatsoever, often we have no clue what we should be paying for something. It's really tough to know. Many times I have found cards that appeal to me. Maybe I know they're rare. Maybe I know something about the cards, but they're so rare, I've never really seen one sell, or it's not a card that's like just stored easily up here in terms of what its value is. I try to go find what did this card sell for to see, is what the dealer is asking for it, is what the eBay seller is asking for it reasonable, is it too high? I can go off my gut and my intuition, but there's always that piece in the back of my mind that's like, well, if this card last sold for $100, I don't want to pay $500 for it today. That's kind of what you think about. So, in a sense, we allow what others have been willing to pay in the past and what we think someone may be willing to pay in the future to dictate what we are willing to pay now. The point that Victory makes here is a really good one, but at the same time, we do use the data to try to form our judgments. Now, let's take this Stephen Curry card, his 2009 Topps Chrome Refractor to 500, PSA 10. Fun fact here, there was no Topps Chrome in 2009. Chrome was an insert set within 2009 Topps. So this Chrome Refractor to 500 was in the Topps set. How much would you be willing to pay for this card without any data and without any comps? If I came to you, and even if you know Steph Curry's market, pretend you don't know what this card sold for recently, how do you know what to pay for it without any data? A little bit of fun here we'll have with some gifts and some emojis and things throughout this. A lot of people would have question marks, especially if they don't know anything about the history of where this card has been or what it's sold for. So even with the data, let's go back to a specific time, point in time. 3 different sales. This card sells relatively rarely, Pop 28. From April 22nd of 2020 until March 12th of 2021, how much would you have been willing to pay on May 21st of 2021, 2 months after it sold on here for around a little under $100,000? How much would you have paid for this? So you've got the data and you're going, what am I going to pay for this card? Well, let's take a look at this. And let's say that you would have been willing to pay $121,000. So you're willing to go 20%, more than 20% above the last comp. But the card sells for $126,655. That's a 585% increase from back in April of 2020, basically a year, 13 months earlier. So you just missed out on the card. That was your max. Well, then take a look at what happens to that card next. The card shoots up in the next sale in January of 2022 to $228,000. So it goes up $100K, right? 80% increase in price. And you're looking at that card saying, I wish I had known. Now this card that I've always wanted, I'm totally priced out of. And in that way, Victory's point here is well taken, and it's a really, really good point. But beware, the reverse can happen. Imagine, this is an imaginary scenario. Caught some flack from people last week because they don't like to use their imagination. Imagine a scenario where 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle PSA 9 comes up for auction. This, if you remember, is the one that was famously brokered by PWCC with Rob G. That sold for $5.2 million in January of 2021. This card is Pop 6, just 3 higher. So here's the scenario, okay? We're going to kind of step through this. You've got all these people who are willing or interested in buying this card, but at different price points. And this is how auctions work, right? You have a huge group of people who are willing to pay for a card up to a specific price. Once you bump up another bracket, even fewer people are willing, and then even fewer people are willing. Once you get to that top point, what a card actually sells for, typically you have 2, maybe 3 people jockeying at that final price point, ultimately setting where the auction closes in price. So in this imaginary scenario, we've got a handful of players. We've got Elon Musk, we've got Jeff Bezos, we've got Michael Jordan, we've got Kevin Durant. Then we've got buyers 5 to 10 who are willing to pay the next highest amount. Buyers 11 to 30, buyers 31 to 75, and so on and so forth, all the way down to the price point where you have 500 buyers willing to pay a specific price for this card. The card goes up to auction, and Elon Musk wins the card for $5.1 million, just below what Rob G paid for it last year in January. He's smiling. He feels good. Jeff Bezos isn't happy. None of the other guys are happy that they missed out on this card, but Elon wins the bid. Let's say that happened back at the end of March of this year. And then, lo and behold, another PSA 9, another one of the 6 very rare PSA 9 Mickey Mantles comes up for auction a month later, April 30th. That card now, assuming all things hold steady, which obviously is not always going to be the case at all. Things are going to shift. There's going to be other factors that come into play. But assuming some standard variables here, remember that Bezos was willing to pay up to around $5 million for that card, and he just missed out on it at 5.1. But the next closest one here was $4.3 million, and this is mislabeled. This should say 5.0 million, 5 million. The next closest amount that somebody's willing to pay is $4.3 million. That's Michael Jordan. So what does that mean? It means Jeff Bezos gets that card at $4.4 million. Let's say that it's a $100,000 increments, minimum bid increment. Now Bezos is laughing. Elon Musk, not so much. He's kind of thinking, maybe I just got, the short end of the stick here. I didn't know there was going to be another one of these cards coming up for auction so soon. So all the same players in there. Bezos is laughing. Elon's not. Well, then another one of these cards comes up for sale. Somebody who's holding this PSA 9 is saying, you know what? I'll take that money. I'll take $4 million. I need the money for something else, or I think there's a better card I'm chasing, or I want a Lamborghini or something else, right? Now that card hits on auction in the middle of May. 2 weeks later, Michael Jordan wins the card at $3.6 million. $3.5 million was the next closest bid for Kevin Durant, even though Jordan was willing to pay $4.3 million for that card. Previously, again, same factor here. Now you've got Elon really thinking, you've got Bezos a little more serious, and MJ's laughing. And flash forward to the final scenario, another one hits for auction at the beginning of June, and KD wins this one for $2.9 million, and you can see the price trajectory and the emotional reactions to these as this card continues to come down in value. This is an interesting case study, right? What is the value of a card? So we can see here, this is what the chart would show with the price trajectory of this card. $5.1 million down to 4.4, down to 3.6, down to $2.9 million. So what is this card actually worth? What is this card actually worth? Basic valuation principle here, right? An item is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it. I kind of put only in blue because you could just say an item is worth what someone is willing to pay for it. Maybe it's worth a lot, so saying only isn't totally appropriate, but an item is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it. So imagine another scenario, not card related. This time we're talking about video games. Brand new Xbox releases. 2 million units sell in the first week for $399. 1,000 units then sell on the secondary market for $599 slightly thereafter, let's say in the following week. So how much is this Xbox worth? What is its value? The answer is that it's worth as much as you can find someone willing to pay for it. That's the answer. So how do we get to that? And again, an item only worth what someone is willing to pay for it. There's a whole bunch of factors here that we can map out. And I'm sure that what I'm about to show is not comprehensive. If I miss some things here, please feel free to leave it down in the comments and let me know what those other factors would be that are really critical in here. I'm positive I've missed some super obvious things. But let's talk about scarcity and let's talk about exposure. Obviously, we know supply and demand drives value, drives price, but this is kind of breaking it down a little bit more, okay? Scarcity is the combination of rarity plus demand. What is rarity? We talked about this last week. We talked about it in the past. Low print run, low population, right? And demand is driven by several factors, but we could mention hype. We can mention the iconic nature and the legacy of a card or an item. And we can talk about the sheer number of people in a market, just in a market interested in the particular item, right? Exposure, what is the sales platform? What is the selling vehicle? How is this being done? How many users does that platform, have? eBay's able to charge the fees that they charge because you're basically paying for exposure to a whole bunch of people, to a broad audience, to have eyeballs on your cards. And how easy is it to use that platform? How functional is it? You could put in here, what are their fee rates and all that stuff, but that's really what it comes down to. And then finally, the marketing around that item. The hardware piece, what I'm talking about is like, what kind of cameras are they using? What kind of, pictures, the quality of the pictures, the videos, the storytelling. Goldin has done a really nice job with Ken and others on their team starting to tell stories around key auction items. That's definitely going to drive hype. That's going to create a lot of buzz around something, and it helps create a narrative around a card and makes you maybe think twice about it if you weren't previously interested. So these are all the factors, and then there's a huge one. There's a really, really big one, and that's the economy. That's what we've seen change over the last several months, especially over the last year, but especially since the first of the year and continuing to head in that direction. So here's a whole bunch of factors. Let me know what I missed down in the comments. So let's go to another scenario. What would you have paid, would you have paid more than $19,400 for this Michael Jordan BGS 9.5 Jambalaya back on March 22nd of 2020, when it last sold for $9.3K almost 2 years prior? How much would you have paid for this card? If this was a card you were really after, that you hadn't seen come up for auction, in a couple of years, really, and you really wanted that BGS 9.5, how much would you have paid for that card? Well, depending, look at what happened to it next. 559% increase. This card went from $19,000 to $109,000 from March of 2020 to October of 2021. Obviously a big duration in there. This is not a card that sells super often. We saw that card kind of remain flat from October of 2021. Again, actually there was a sale of this card 3 weeks later. So that example I used with the mantle, while it seems outlandish that you'd have 4 in a row selling, it is not outlandish that you'd have 2 selling within a month of each other when they so rarely come up for sales. What happened here, almost certainly, is that somebody saw that card sell at the beginning of October for $109,000 and said, that's it, that's my sell point. I bought this card years ago for $5,000, $9,000, $19,000. I'm going to sell this one now and take the profit and feel really good about that. The market value of that card has now exceeded my personal value that I attribute to this. I'm going to take the money. So you had another one sell, and then you had another one sell in May of this year for a record high of $126,000. So May 19, 2022, $126,000. But then look at what happened here. Another one came up for sale just a month later, and it sold a couple of days ago, back on the 16th of June, for $72,000. So this card came down $54,000 from $126K down to $72K, 43% decrease. So what is this card actually worth? What is the value of this card? It can get a little bit tricky to say when you actually say, hey, this thing is worth this amount of money, because you have to go back to all those factors that come into play. So what happened here? In the last month, what happened? Well, a few really important things happened. Like I said, the economy. Over the last 4 weeks, the amount of news cycles saying recession, 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 it's coming, recession's coming, has really ramped up. News drastically impacts public opinion, so that's a huge factor. And then the demand went down 1. So maybe a month ago, this person who just missed out on this card at $126,000, maybe they were willing to pay $125,000. Maybe a month later, they were still willing to pay $125,000 for this card, but they didn't have to, because the next closest bid for that card was only $71,000. And so they got it for a much better deal. So the demand went down by 1. It's also possible that within the platform, because of the economy, the number of users, the number of eyes on that card decreased relative to a month prior, when people may have not been quite as worried about what was going on and where the direction of the market was headed overall. So going back to Victory's slides here, let's take it back. This was that original middle one. If you like something, there is always someone else with the same taste, but they may just be a few steps behind you. And noticing what truly sets a market value is when a collector gets his hands on something of limited supply and he's unwilling to let it go. When what it's worth to him meets what someone else is willing to pay, there you have market value. So going back to that example where the jambalaya sold within a month of each other for the same price, around $108,000 or so, I think, that's what happened. Somebody saw it, said, I'm willing to let it go. They got their money, and somebody else was happy to pay that amount for it. So what happens here, right? Very basic. Seller says it's worth $1,400 to me. Buyer says it's worth $1,700 to me. A new perceived value is set when this transaction happens. It's new, it's highly subjective, and it's often very transitory value. That's what happens. There's all those other factors that can come into play that can impact the price the next time the card sells or transacts between two parties. Let's bring it into a more narrow example and talk about the value of a one of one. So this card only exists, there's only one of them available, so you can't have usually sales comps easily for that card. You can have analogous sales. Maybe it comes up for sale, the same card, multiple times. But the value of a one-of-one, so take this scenario. Let's say a one-of-one Patty Mills card sells for $500. Let's say it's Prism Nebula. It sells for $500 on auction to bidder A. Is the card worth $500 if it were to go up for auction again a month later, and what would it sell for? The possible outcome number 1. This is the most probable in my opinion. Most likely it would sell for less, because it would only sell for the difference between what bidders B and C were willing to pay for the card, not A and B. A's moving it, now B and C are fighting over it at a lower price point probably. Furthermore, Caveat, right? If it sold on eBay, we actually have no way of knowing if it was actually paid for. It may have been shill bid, it may have been driven up. The buyer may have just backed out on the card, and maybe the seller or the consignor waited for it to be paid for 2 weeks, had to cancel it, then had to go through the process of relisting. We don't actually know if it even actually sold for $500. Possible outcome number 2, it is possible that the prospective buyer who missed it the first time, or who majorly regretted not bidding more, or who possibly came into more funds, ends up getting it ends up in the game this time around. So maybe they missed it, or maybe somebody has more money, and so bidder B still has their baseline of $490 or whatever they're willing to pay, and somebody else says, you know what, I'm not missing it this time. I have more ability to pay for it, or I can't bear the thought of missing out on a second chance. So it could sell for more than $500. Now, what about buy it nows? What about a buy it now on a one of one? So buy it now sales are even more problematic predictors of value. If a seller lists a card for $500 because that's the value that they assign to it, that's their value and their willingness to move it, to part with it, and then somebody immediately buys it, that card could be worth significantly more than $500. We have no way of knowing what potential it had on an open auction, on an open marketplace. It also may have sold for significantly less if it was, the second highest bidder was only willing to pay like $300 for it. So when you see a buy it now on a one of one or a low pop one type card, and somebody pays that, that doesn't mean that's what the card is worth in the next sale opportunity. That means it's what the card was worth at a minimum to the person who ended up buying it, right? So let's bring it back to Victory's here. Now this piece, I totally understand what he's saying, and I'm kind of probably splitting hairs here. But when he says, if you like something, there's always someone else with the same taste. They may just be a few steps behind. This is not always true. Player collectors of less sought after players, like for example, my Andre Drummond PC, there may not always be somebody who's after the card. Or if they are, they might be willing to pay significantly less. Typically, I like to buy Drummond one of one cards on auctions because I know that's how I can always get the best value on a card. When it's a buy it now, and if you go on eBay right now and search Drummond one of one cards, you'll see a whole bunch of them listed, but they're on buy it nows and they're way too high. They're way too high. So let's say in a scenario someone DMs me on Instagram with a rare one of one Drummond, they're asking far more than what I know the fair market value of that card to be. I know the Drummond market. I know what's reasonable. I know what the card would go for on open auction roughly. And more important, I know the value of the card to me. So I refuse to pay a massive premium for a card that's purely PC that would never command that kind of value on a resale if I ever actually needed to liquidate and sell my PC to support my family, for example. So back to this question, what is a card really worth? Now, at the end of the day, at the end of the proverbial day, the unspecified, not the 24-hour day, but the end of time, a card is only worth whatever a true collector is willing to pay for it. Someone needs to want to hold that card for a lifetime. They need to obtain it and to want to obtain it and to never let it go, to prioritize the value of owning it more than the prospect of whatever money could be secured in exchange for it. That's sort of like the baseline driving value, and the value won't change until somebody else comes along and is willing to somehow get it above that value point. And maybe that's the example like we saw with the Jordan Jambalaya earlier. So the closing slide that I hadn't shown earlier that Victory said is an emotional and nostalgic hobby, which is exactly what this hobby is, wasn't built to be robotic and mostly led by sales data. Learn, research, buy with conviction, and use the data, but don't worship it. And he says, who doesn't love some great data? I do. These are points very, very well taken and well respected. I obviously love the data, and I really agree with Victory here on his sentiment around these thoughts, the value of a card. I think there's some important distinctions in there, but a lot to think about when it comes to how you value a card and you want to make a purchase, especially if it is something nostalgic and emotional, something for your PC or a card that you're really passionate about and chasing after. So, price, it's incredibly subjective and circumstantial. Timing the market can be really difficult. I mentioned at the end of my video last week that I had intended this week to talk about the challenges of selling at the peak. I still plan to address that in an upcoming video, but once I saw Victory's post, it really got me thinking, and it seemed like a great segue from last week's video. So what I really want to reiterate more than anything here is that it's the collectors who set the true value, the sustainable market value of the cardboard. As Victory said, if you're a collector and a rare item that you've been after pops up, You really need to rely as much on your own intuition and personal attribution of value to the card as you do the recent sales history data. Don't let an opportunity pass you up just because you think you should only pay what it recently sold for or less or slightly more. Now in Market Movers, we have intentionally avoided predictive pricing for a myriad of reasons. You might be asking the question, what about, why don't you guys just try to help predict the price of a card? We've avoided it for a lot of reasons, and I may get into all those reasons some other time. It's not something we have ruled out by any means. We discuss it as a team all the time, but there are so many confounding factors when it comes to card prices. This is a mostly illogical market driven by reactions, nostalgia, and emotions. And sometimes knowledge gaps, what we might call ignorance, not in a pejorative sense, but just in a true sense, way more driven by those things than it is by logic and sound algorithms. If cardboard and the cards that we buy were all driven by logic and the way that it should work based on true rarity and the prestige of a set, prices of these cards would be significantly different. Our ratios data would be way more consistent and have a much tighter standard deviation. None of those things is true. So historical data, it doesn't tell you what a card is worth. Historical data tells you where a card has been. It tells you about its price journey, which can be used to learn, to tell stories, and to try to predict where the card is going. But a card is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it at a specific point in time. And a card is only has long-term value if collectors want to continue to own and desire that card for the long term. So that's a lot. Thank you for staying with me. Again, this is something, really passionate about this. Would love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments. As always, thank you so much. If you would be so kind, go ahead and leave me a like on this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be notified of new videos. See you next week.